The blood trail was easy to follow against the pristine white snow, dark droplets marking a desperate journey. Walter Miller squinted through the veil of swirling flakes, tracking the German shepherd as she limped determinedly through the growing blizzard. She carried something in her mouth, a package of ground beef he recognized from his own store's freezer. The dog's ribs protruded sharply beneath her matted fur. Yet despite her obvious starvation, she refused to eat. Walter had seen hungry before. Vietnam had taught him that lesson well. But this was different. A raw determination that transcended survival instinct. When she collapsed momentarily in a drift, he nearly approached, but some deeper understanding held him back. This wasn't surrender. She rose again, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air, each labored step carrying her closer to something or someone more important than her own life. The forecast called for the worst storm in 50 years. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Walter Miller hadn't always been the owner of Second Chance Pet Supply. 40 years in the Army had hardened him in ways that only other veterans understood. At 68, his body carried the permanent aches of a soldier, but his eyes, sharp blue beneath bushy gray eyebrows, missed nothing. Especially not when inventory started disappearing from his storeroom 3 weeks ago. Mountain Ridge, Colorado had never been a place for locking doors. The small town of 1,200 souls, nestled in the Rockies, operated on handshakes and neighborly trust. Tourism kept them afloat in summer months, but winter transformed them into an island of self-sufficiency, particularly when the mountain passes closed. Walter lived alone in the apartment above his shop since Martha passed 5 years back. Cancer took her quick. The shop had been her idea, something for retirement. "Animals don't judge," she'd said. "They just love." Words that rang hollow until they didn't. The storm brewing outside promised to be historic. Radio called it the Behemoth, a polar system pushing record-low temperatures across 3 states. Forecasts predicted 3 feet of snow within 48 hours, and temperatures plummeting to -30 with wind chill. The kind of cold that killed livestock and froze pipes 4 feet underground. Eleanor Wilkins had been the first to warn him. At 85, she remained Mountain Ridge's living memory, her Victorian home at the edge of town filled with photographs of 3 generations of soldiers. Her son had commanded troops in Afghanistan, never came home. Eleanor still baked apple pies for the VFW hall every month, and knew more about military working dogs than the Pentagon itself. "Animals sense things," she'd told Walter yesterday, her arthritic hands clutching a mug of tea. "They're battening down. This storm isn't natural. Sarah Thompson had confirmed it." The town's veterinarian was struggling to keep her clinic doors open, a single mother with more compassion than business sense. "Something spooking the wildlife," she'd said. "Bears that should be hibernating. Elk coming down too early." Then there was Robert Davidson, newer to town, isolated. The younger veteran lived in a cabin outside town limits. Walter recognized the haunted look, same one he'd seen in the mirror after Vietnam. Some wars followed you home. Walter hadn't expected any of them to become entangled in what he discovered next. The first package of ground beef disappeared on a Tuesday. Walter might not have noticed, except it was the last of his personal supply, tucked behind bags of kibble in the shop's small freezer. By Friday, 2 more packages had vanished, along with a bag of beef jerky from the counter display. "Getting forgetful, old man," he muttered to himself, but Walter Miller hadn't survived 3 tours in Vietnam by ignoring his instincts. He installed a simple security camera that Saturday. Nothing fancy, just a motion-activated trail cam from the hunting section. The footage shocked him. Not teenagers or desperate addicts, but a German shepherd, painfully thin, coat matted and dull, with a distinctive scar across her muzzle. She moved with the precision of training, slipping through the partially broken loading dock door just after midnight. Most surprising was what she did with the food. She didn't tear into it desperately as a starving animal might. Instead, she carried each package carefully in her mouth and disappeared back into the night. Walter began leaving food intentionally. Better quality kibble, fresh chicken from his own fridge. Each night she returned. Each night she took only what she could carry. "Something ain't right," Walter told Eleanor over coffee at Maggie's diner. "Dog's starving but won't eat on sight." Eleanor's weathered hands wrapped around her mug. "She's feeding something else. Puppies, most likely." The weather report interrupted their conversation, blaring from the diner's ancient radio. The storm had accelerated, no longer 2 days away but hours. Governor declaring state of emergency, roads closing by noon. "Best find those pups before the storm hits," Eleanor said softly. Walter drove his old Ford pickup to the shop, gathering supplies, blankets, extra food, his winter emergency kit. The ache in his left knee, shrapnel souvenir from '72, warned of the dropping pressure. Snow began falling as he followed the dog's tracks away from town, not toward the residential areas, but east toward the abandoned grist mill. The trail disappeared at points, then reappeared, a deliberate path taken many times. The historic mill had been empty for decades, its water wheel frozen in time. Dangerous, the town council declared it, off limits. Perfect shelter for something that didn't want to be found. Walter's breath clouded as he approached the weathered structure. Wind whipped between broken slats. Inside, darkness waited, broken by slivers of gray daylight through the damaged roof. "Hello?" His voice echoed. No human response, but he heard it then, the faint whimpering of puppies. Following the sound, Walter discovered them in what once was the mill office. 5 small forms huddled together on a makeshift bed of old burlap sacks. The German shepherd mother stood protectively over them, a low growl rumbling in her throat. "Easy, girl," Walter raised his hand slowly. "Not here to hurt anyone." The dog's eyes reflected intelligence beyond instinct. Her puppies, maybe 6 weeks old, were thin but alive. 4 stronger ones clustered around a 5th, the runt visibly weaker than its siblings. As Walter crouched at a safe distance, he noticed something glinting on the mother's neck. Partially embedded in matted fur, military dog tags. The pieces clicked. Not just any stray, but a trained military working dog. The precision of her movements, the strategic thinking, the scar, likely from combat. His phone buzzed. Sarah Thompson texting. Stormfront moving faster. Pass closing in 1 hour. Everyone evacuating. Walter looked at the dog family, then outside at the thickening snow. The mother dog's eyes met his, tired, desperate, but undefeated. "Guess we're all coming home with me," he said. As he prepared to transport them, Walter heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being racked. "Step away from my property," came a voice behind him. Walter turned slowly, hands raised. Robert Davidson stood in the doorway, weapon aimed at Walter's chest. his eyes wild, beard unkempt, body tense with the hypervigilance Walter recognized all too well. "Robert," Walter kept his voice level, "these animals need help. Storm's coming." "She's mine," Robert's voice cracked. "They're all I have left." Behind them, the runt puppy gave a pitiful cry. The mother dog looked between Robert and her weakest pup, caught between loyalties. "That small one won't survive the night without help," Walter said gently, "and neither will the rest of them if this storm hits as hard as they're saying." Robert's hands trembled on the shotgun, the same hands that had once patched up wounded soldiers in Kandahar. "You don't understand," Robert whispered. "I can't go back to town. I can't." The first heavy gusts of wind rattled the mill's remaining windows, punctuating the urgency of their situation. Time was running out for all of them. Walter's fingers tightened around the military dog tags he'd pried from the matted fur. Through years of grime and blood, the engraving was still legible. Heidi, 5438 MW DUSARMY. Below that, a blood type and deployment dates to Afghanistan. This wasn't just any German shepherd. This was a war hero. "Where'd you get these tags, Robert?" Walter kept his voice steady, despite the shotgun aimed at his chest. The wind howled through the mill's broken windows, snowflakes swirling between them like tiny messengers of the storm to come. Robert's eyes darted between Walter and the dog. "She found me. Or I found her. Does it matter now?" "It might, to Eleanor Wilkins." Walter watched the recognition flash across Robert's face. "She trained military working dogs for 30 years. Recognized your dog from the description I gave her yesterday." The shotgun wavered slightly. "Eleanor?" The old lady with the Victorian house, the smallest puppy, whimpered, drawing the mother dog's, Heidi's, attention. She turned from the standoff, nudging her weakest offspring with a gentleness that contradicted her battle-scarred appearance. "She lost her son in Afghanistan," Walter continued. "Lieutenant Colonel James Wilkins. Ring any bells?" Robert's face drained of color. The shotgun lowered an inch. "My commanding officer. The ambush at Kandahar." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't know he was from here." Outside, the wind's intensity doubled, rattling the ancient structure. A section of roof gave way in the far corner, sending snow cascading into the mill. "We've got less than an hour before this place might collapse," Walter said. "That puppy needs medical attention. They all do." He nodded toward Heidi. "Her, too. And you." "I'm fine," Robert snapped, but his hands shook visibly now. "Sure you are. We all are." Walter's tone softened with the understanding of shared demons. "I came home from Vietnam in '73. Know what that homecoming was like? 40 years, and I still wake up some nights back in the jungle." The shotgun lowered completely. "They used dogs against us," Robert said suddenly. "The insurgents. Strapped with explosives. We couldn't. I couldn't." A violent gust rocked the mill again. This time, beams groaned in protest. "We need to leave. Now." Walter pulled out his phone. 1 bar of service. "I'm calling Sarah Thompson. She's a vet. Then we're going to Eleanor's. It's closest, and her house has a generator." Robert looked panicked. "I can't face her. Not after." "You can, and you will," Walter said firmly, "because right now it's about survival. Yours, mine, these dogs." As Walter dialed, the final surprise revealed itself. Heidi limped toward Robert and nudged his hand, the same gentle motion she'd used with her puppies. "Not fear, but recognition." "She knows you," Walter observed. "She should," Robert's voice cracked. "She pulled me from the Humvee after the IED. before the fire reached the ammunition. Only survivor of my unit. Walter connected with Sarah, explaining the situation in clipped sentences as he watched Robert sink to his knees beside Heidi. "I thought she died over there," Robert whispered, burying his face in the dog's neck. "When I saw her in town 3 months ago, it all came back. Everything. The screams, the blood. I couldn't." "Sarah's on her way," Walter interrupted gently. "She'll meet us at Eleanor's. Can you help me get the puppies to my truck?" Outside, the first major wall of the storm arrived. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The temperature plummeted as Arctic air descended upon Mountain Ridge. Robert gathered the smallest puppy inside his coat, while Walter prepared a crate for the others. Together they loaded Heidi and her family into Walter's pickup. The roads were already treacherous, nearly impassable, but Walter knew every turn and dip of the 5 miles to Eleanor Wilkins' Victorian house on the edge of town. What awaited them there would change everything. The journey to Eleanor's Victorian house should have taken 15 minutes. It took nearly an hour. Walter's old Ford pickup fought through snowdrifts already knee-deep, windshield wipers barely keeping pace with the relentless blizzard. Beside him, Robert sat rigid, the smallest puppy cradled inside his jacket, its tiny head occasionally emerging for air. "This one's fadin'," Robert said, military medic training evident in his clinical assessment. "Dehydration, malnutrition, possible pneumonia." In the truck bed, secured in crates and blankets, Heidi and her other 4 puppies huddled against the biting cold. Walter had cranked the heat full blast, but the temperature gauge on his dashboard registered 7 degrees and falling. "Eleanor's place is just beyond that ridge," Walter pointed through a momentary break in the whiteout. The 2-story Victorian emerged like a ghost ship on a frozen sea, its gables and widow's walk stark against the gunmetal sky. A single window glowed golden with lamplight. The town itself was already shutting down. Main Street businesses had closed, windows boarded against the coming onslaught. The evacuation order had sent most residents to the high school gymnasium on higher ground, away from potential avalanche paths. Walter's tires slid as he turned into Eleanor's long driveway. "She'll have the wood stove going. Generator, too." Robert's knuckles whitened around the puppy. "I can't face her." "You already are." Walter cut the engine. "Sometimes the hardest steps are the only ones worth taking." The front door opened before they reached the porch, Eleanor's silhouette framed by warm light. At 85, she stood straight as a flagpole, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, eyes sharp as ever beneath wire-rimmed spectacles. "Thought you might not make it," she called above the wind's howl. Her gaze passed over Robert without a flicker of recognition, then settled on the crates. "Bring them around back. Sunroom's warmer." Walter and Robert carried the dogs through the kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. The sunroom had been transformed into a makeshift veterinary ward. Sarah Thompson was already there, unpacking medical supplies on a folding table. "You made it." Sarah looked up, relief evident on her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, the lines around her eyes betraying exhaustion. "Roads are officially closed now. Sheriff's pulled everyone off patrol." Heidi emerged from her crates cautiously, immediately checking each puppy as Walter and Robert released them. The runt lay motionless on a blanket, its breathing shallow. "Start with this one." Robert handed the weakest puppy to Sarah. Their fingers brushed briefly, and something passed between them, a current of shared concern. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching. "I'll make coffee. You all look half frozen." Her eyes lingered on Robert's face, searching. "Don't believe we've been properly introduced, young man." Robert swallowed hard. "Robert Davidson, ma'am. Former Army medic. Davidson," Eleanor repeated slowly. "From the cabin by Miller's Creek?" He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Well, Mr. Davidson, there's fresh towels in the bathroom down the hall. You look like you could use some cleaning up." Her tone was neither warm nor cold, simply practical. After Eleanor left, Sarah began examining the runt. "This one's in trouble. Severe malnutrition, respiratory infection." She glanced up at Walter. "What's the story here? These aren't ordinary strays." Walter handed her Heidi's dog tags. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she read them. "Military working dog," she whispered. Her eyes darted to Robert, who was helping the other puppies settle on a pile of blankets. "Afghanistan?" "Kandahar," Walter confirmed quietly. "Robert's unit." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face, quickly replaced by something else, a shadow of old pain. She returned her attention to the sick puppy with renewed determination. Outside, the storm's intensity doubled. Wind screamed around the eaves of the old house. The power flickered, once, twice, then stabilized. "Generators holding," Walter observed. "For now," Sarah replied. "I've got maybe 3 hours of oxygen in these tanks for the puppy." After that, she left the sentence unfinished. Heidi paced anxiously between her puppies and the door, her training evident in her disciplined movements. When Robert returned from cleaning up, she went to him immediately, pressing against his leg. "She remembers you," Walter said. Robert's hand hesitantly touched Heidi's head. "I don't deserve her loyalty." "That's not for you to decide," Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. She carried a tray with coffee mugs and a plate of sandwiches. "Dogs don't judge the way people do." The room fell silent, except for the storm's assault and the labored breathing of the smallest puppy. 4 strangers and 6 dogs, thrown together by circumstance and an approaching disaster none of them fully comprehended yet. Eleanor set the tray down and fixed Robert with a penetrating stare. "Now, Mr. Davidson, while Dr. Thompson works, perhaps you can explain exactly how one of our military's most decorated search and rescue dogs ended up half-starved in an abandoned mill with 5 puppies in the middle of winter." Robert's face went pale. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily over her patient. Walter moved closer to Heidi, sensing the tension building like the storm outside. Robert began, but was interrupted by a tremendous crack. The house shuddered as if struck by a giant hand. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. "Transformers blown," Walter said grimly, reaching for his flashlight. "Generator should kick in." They waited in tense silence. No lights returned. "Main line must be damaged," Eleanor sighed. "Backup generators in the cellar. Walter, you know where." As Walter moved to check the generator, another sound reached them. A low rumble that grew quickly in intensity. "Avalanche," Sarah whispered, her professional composure cracking. "East slope." The rumble grew to a roar. Too close, much too close. Walter's flashlight beam caught the moment when Heidi suddenly stiffened, ears alert. Before anyone could react, she bolted to the far corner of the sunroom and began frantically pawing at the floor, barking with urgent purpose. Robert was the first to understand. "She's alerting. There's something." The floor beneath them creaked ominously. "Everyone out!" Walter shouted. "Now!" They grabbed puppies and supplies, rushing toward the door as the ancient timber foundations of Eleanor's Victorian groaned beneath the weight of snow and shifting earth. Outside, The full fury of the storm enveloped them, along with the terrible knowledge that Mountain Ridge was now completely cut off from the outside world. The avalanche hadn't hit Eleanor's Victorian directly, but it had taken out the power lines and blocked the eastern access road completely. In the beam of Walter's flashlight, they watched as snow continued cascading down the distant slope, a white phantom devouring everything in its path. Main house is still structurally sound, Eleanor assessed, her practical nature taking precedence over panic. It's just the sunroom extension that's compromised. The original builders knew what they were doing. They had retreated to Eleanor's living room, a space dominated by a massive stone fireplace that now provided their only heat and light. The puppies huddled together on a quilt by the hearth, while Sarah administered emergency care to the runt, now officially named Hope. "His oxygen levels are dropping," Sarah murmured, her stethoscope pressed against the tiny chest.
"Without power for the oxygen concentrator." Robert knelt beside her, his earlier reluctance forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. "I've got trauma medical training. Tell me what you need." Outside, the storm had achieved a malevolence that none of them had witnessed before. Wind speeds topped 60 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally past the windows. The temperature had plummeted to 15 below zero. Radio reports, when they could receive them on Eleanor's battery-powered emergency radio, confirmed that Mountain Ridge was entirely cut off. No emergency services could reach them for at least 48 hours. "Town emergency shelter at the high school has generator power," Walter reported after fiddling with the radio dial. "Sheriff's advising everyone to stay where they are, unless in immediate danger." Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, staring into the blinding whiteness. "In my 85 years, I've never seen a storm like this." Her voice carried the weight of someone who recognized an unprecedented threat. "This isn't just weather. This is a reckoning." Heidi paced the perimeter of the room, checking each window and door with military precision, occasionally returning to her puppies. Her behavior reflected her training, vigilant, protective, constantly assessing. "She was the best search and rescue dog in our unit," Robert said quietly, watching her. "Could find survivors buried under 20 feet of rubble. Saved dozens of lives, including yours," Walter observed. Robert nodded, his eyes haunted. "The IED hit our convoy outside Kandahar. 3 vehicles, 16 men. I was pinned in the wreckage when the fuel line caught fire." His voice dropped to a whisper. "She dragged me out by my tactical vest. Went back in for others, but there wasn't time before the ammunition cooked off." Eleanor had gone very still, her back to the room. "When was this?" "April 18th, 2019, Robert answered automatically. "Lieutenant Colonel Wilkins was in the lead vehicle." The room fell silent, except for the howling wind and crackling fire. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "I should have died with them," Robert continued, words spilling out like poison from a lanced wound. "After I was discharged, the nightmare started. Couldn't sleep, couldn't function. The VA prescribed pills that made me a zombie." Sarah continued working on Hope, but her hands trembled slightly. Walter noticed a single tear track down her cheek before she brushed it away. "I moved here to disappear," Robert said. "Then 3 months ago I saw her in town. Heidi. It was impossible. She was supposed to have died in Afghanistan. The shock of seeing her, it triggered everything, all the memories, the guilt. I followed her to the mill. She had puppies. She was surviving on her own. And his voice broke. I couldn't even manage that much." "So you took her," Walter said, pieces finally connecting. "Thought she could help you." "I thought we could help each other," Robert corrected. "But I was too broken. Some days I couldn't even leave the cabin to feed them properly. She started foraging on her own, finding food wherever she could. Sarah looked up from her ministrations, anger flashing in her eyes. "You let them starve, rather than ask for help." "I couldn't," Robert started. "You couldn't what?" Sarah interrupted, voice rising. "My clinic is open to anyone, no questions asked. These puppies are suffering from weeks of malnutrition. This one might not make it through the night." "That's enough, Sarah." Eleanor's quiet voice cut through the tension. She had turned from the window, her face composed but pale. "We all have our demons." A tremendous gust shook the house to its foundations. The living room windows rattled in their frames, and a fine dust of plaster sifted from the ceiling. Without warning, one of the ancient window panes shattered inward, sending glass shards across the hardwood floor and allowing a violent swirl of snow into the room. Robert moved fastest, grabbing a quilt from the sofa and rushing to cover the broken window. Walter was close behind with a sheet of plywood from Eleanor's emergency supplies. Together they secured the makeshift barrier, while Heidi gathered her puppies away from the danger. "We need to move to the cellar," Eleanor announced. "This old house has weathered many storms, but I've never heard the joints creaking like this." They gathered blankets, food, medical supplies, and the portable radio. Robert carried Hope, still on the makeshift oxygen setup, while Sarah supervised. Walter helped Eleanor navigate the narrow cellar stairs, aware of how the fierce independence in her eyes warred with the frailty of her aging body. The cellar was surprisingly warm and well-stocked. Root vegetables hung in mesh bags from ceiling beams. Preserves lined shelves against one wall. A small wood stove squatted in the corner, already radiating heat. "I grew up during the Cold War," Eleanor explained, noting Walter's raised eyebrow at her preparations. "Old habits." As they settled in, arranging bedding and supplies for what might be days underground, the dynamics between them shifted subtly. Crisis had a way of stripping pretense, leaving only the essential elements of character exposed. They worked mostly in silence. Eleanor preparing a simple meal of soup and bread, Sarah continuing her care of Hope, Robert tending to Heidi and the healthier puppies. Walter found himself observing them all, recognizing in each face the particular strain of unspoken grief. When Eleanor handed Robert a bowl of soup, their fingers touched briefly. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "I'm sorry about your son," he said, voice barely audible. Eleanor nodded once, her composure never wavering. "As am I, for your comrades. Eat your soup before it gets cold." The tension in the cellar thickened. Unspoken histories and connections hovering like ghosts in the shadows beyond the wood stove's light. Sarah administered another round of antibiotics to Hope, her movements increasingly desperate as the puppy's condition deteriorated. Above them, the storm reached its peak intensity. The entire house shuddered under its assault. Dirt sifted between floor joists. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. Roads closed indefinitely. Power outages throughout the county. National Guard mobilizing, but unable to reach isolated communities. "They're saying it could last another 36 hours, Walter reported grimly. "Hope doesn't have that long," Sarah said, professional detachment finally cracking. "His lungs are filling with fluid." Without proper medication, oxygen. Robert set his soup aside and moved to examine the puppy. His hands, which had been shaking earlier, were suddenly steady, clinical. "I need alcohol, clean cloths, a small tube if you have it, needle, and surgical thread." Sarah stared at him. "What are you thinking?" "Field tracheotomy," he answered.
modified for canine anatomy. I assisted on one during my deployments when a military working dog was caught in an explosion." "That's too risky," Sarah protested. "He's too small, too weak." "He'll die anyway," Robert countered. "At least this gives him a chance." While they debated, Walter noticed Eleanor watching Robert with a strange intensity. Not grief or anger, as he might have expected, but something closer to recognition. "Your father was a veterinarian," she said suddenly, "in Wisconsin." Robert froze. "How did you know that?" "James, my son, he mentioned you in his letters. Said you had a touch with the unit's dogs." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Said you reminded him of his father." Same steady hands in a crisis. The revelation hung in the air between them, a fragile thread connecting past to present. Whatever Robert might have said in response was lost, as a violent crash echoed above them, followed by the distinct sound of splintering wood. Heidi was on her feet instantly, a low growl building in her throat. She positioned herself between the stairs and her puppies, every muscle tense. Walter reached for the hunting rifle Eleanor kept mounted on the cellar wall, checking that it was loaded. "Stay here," he instructed. "All of you." "Not a chance, old man," Robert said, standing beside him. "I've seen enough combat to know you don't face unknown threats alone." The two men exchanged a glance of mutual understanding before ascending the cellar stairs to confront whatever new danger the storm had delivered to Eleanor's doorstep. Behind them, Sarah clutched Hope to her chest, whispering desperate prayers, while Eleanor reached for Heidi, her weathered hand resting on the dog's head in silent communication between two warriors who recognized each other's strength. The living room they had abandoned just hours earlier was now unrecognizable. Half the roof had collapsed under the weight of snow and ice, exposing the interior to the full fury of the blizzard. Wind whipped through the space, scattering belongings and driving snow into every corner. And in the center of the destruction stood a figure, hooded, snow-covered, swaying on its feet. "Don't move!" Walter raised the rifle. "Identify yourself!" The figure slowly raised gloved hands. "Help," came a faint voice. "Please." As the intruder collapsed to the floor, Robert rushed forward, medic instincts overriding caution. He pulled back the hood to reveal the bloody, frost-bitten face of a young man no more than 20. "Jason?" Sarah's voice came from the cellar doorway, shock and disbelief evident in her tone. "Jason!" She pushed past Walter, falling to her knees beside the unconscious form of her teenage son. Jason Thompson's appearance had changed everything. The 17-year-old had hiked 3 miles through the blizzard after the high school shelter's generator failed, guided only by his knowledge that his mother would be at Eleanor's house. His body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, his extremities showing early signs of frostbite. "Stupid, brave kid," Robert muttered, as he worked alongside Sarah to stabilize the teenager. They had moved everyone back to the kitchen, the only downstairs room still structurally intact after the roof collapse. "Another 30 minutes out there and we'd be treating severe hypothermia." "The high school's without heat," Jason explained, through chattering teeth, wrapped in every blanket they could spare. "Mayor tried to get everyone to the church basement, but it's flooded from broken pipes. People are panicking." Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, wind speeds approaching hurricane force. The portable radio now picked up only static, their last tenuous connection to the outside world severed. Meanwhile, Hope's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The smallest puppy lay on a makeshift bed, each breath a visible struggle, tiny ribcage heaving with the effort to draw oxygen into fluid-filled lungs. "We're losing him," Sarah whispered, professional detachment abandoned. Her attention was divided now between her son and the dying puppy, maternal instinct warring with veterinary obligation. Robert knelt beside the puppy, his earlier suggestion of emergency intervention hanging unspoken between them. "Sarah, I need to try, now, or it's too late." She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Do it."
Walter helped Eleanor to a chair near the wood stove, positioning her where she could oversee everything without being in the way. The old woman's face betrayed nothing, but Walter noticed how her hand trembled as she stroked one of the healthier puppies that had crawled into her lap. "Been a good long while since I had a dog," Eleanor said softly. "Not since James deployed with his unit. Couldn't bear the thought of another one." Walter understood. After Martha died, he'd resisted pets in the apartment above his shop, despite the obvious irony of owning a pet supply store. "They find their way to us anyway." Eleanor's eyes drifted to where Heidi stood vigilant near her puppies, occasionally checking on Hope with gentle nudges. Military dogs aren't supposed to come home like this. Their equipment, officially. Forms to be signed. Protocols to follow. "Bureaucracy doesn't account for loyalty," Walter replied. "Or coincidence." "Is that what you think this is?" Eleanor's gaze was suddenly sharp. "Coincidence? That dog finding her way to this town, to Robert, during this particular storm?" Before Walter could answer, a pained yelp drew everyone's attention. Robert had begun the delicate procedure on Hope, Sarah assisting with shaking hands. Jason watched with wide eyes, his own discomfort temporarily forgotten. "Hold him still," Robert instructed, his voice commanding but calm. "This has to be precise." Sarah cradled the puppy's tiny head as Robert made a small incision, then carefully inserted a makeshift breathing tube, fashioned from medical supplies in Sarah's kit. Blood welled around the tube, but Robert's hands remained steady. "Suction," he ordered, and Sarah provided it using a bulb syringe. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Hope's tiny body lay still. "Come on," Robert whispered. "Breathe, soldier." As if responding to the command, Hope's chest suddenly rose in a full, clean breath. Robert secured the tube with surgical tape, his expression a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction. "It won't last forever," he cautioned, "but it buys us time." Heidi approached cautiously, sniffing her puppy before gently lying down beside him, her body curled protectively around his small form. The interaction stirred something in Robert's expression, a painful recognition. "She never gave up on him," Robert said more to himself than anyone else, even when logic said she should. Eleanor watched this exchange with knowing eyes. Dogs understand loyalty better than most humans. They don't abandon their pack. The pointed comment wasn't lost on Robert. His shoulders stiffened briefly before he nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. "The storm's expected to last another day, at least," Jason reported, checking his phone out of habit, though it had no service. "And the temperature's still dropping. Town's emergency plan wasn't built for something like this." "Nobody's was," Walter commented. "This is unprecedented." Sarah finished bandaging her son's frostbitten fingers before returning to monitor Hope. "The tracheostomy is helping, but without antibiotics and fluids."
She left the sentence unfinished. "What about your clinic supplies?" Walter asked. "Would anything there help?" "Everything we need is there," Sarah confirmed. "But the clinic's on the other side of town." In this weather, it might as well be on the moon. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the storm's continued assault and the crackling of the wood stove. Each person retreated into private thoughts, calculating odds, weighing risks, confronting limitations. It was Heidi who finally broke the spell. The German Shepherd rose suddenly, ears alert, moving to the kitchen door with purpose. She pawed at it once, then looked back at them with unmistakable intent. "She wants out," Eleanor interpreted. "Impossible," Sarah objected. "She'd freeze in minutes." Robert watched Heidi's behavior with growing understanding. She's not trying to leave. She's trying to lead. He turned to Walter. "The clinic. She's offering to guide us there." "That's insane," Jason protested. "You can't navigate in this. Whiteout conditions? Wind chill at lethal levels?" "Heidi can," Robert said with quiet certainty. "Her sense of smell, her training, she could find her way through anything." "Even if that's true, it's a suicide mission," Sarah argued. "No one could survive exposure for that long." Walter moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass to peer into the raging whiteness beyond. "Maybe not on foot," he conceded, "but my truck has chains and a full tank of gas. If we had a guide who could keep us on the road—" "Absolutely not," Eleanor's voice cut through the debate. "I won't have more lives risked unnecessarily." "With respect, ma'am," Robert said, straightening to his full height. "This isn't your decision to make." He gestured toward Hope. "That puppy will die without proper medical care. Maybe others, too." Eleanor rose from her chair with the slow dignity of age, crossing to stand directly before Robert. Despite being nearly a foot shorter, she somehow managed to look him in the eye as an equal. "My son died because men under his command made impulsive decisions in bad conditions," she said evenly. "I won't watch it happen again in my own kitchen." The room fell silent. Robert's face drained of color, but he held Eleanor's gaze. "James died because I survived," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "He ordered Heidi to pull me out first. His last command." His hands trembled now. "I've been living with that every day since I came home. Don't ask me to watch another death I could have prevented." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition of shared pain that transcended blame. "Jason stays here," she said at last. "And you take the satellite phone from my emergency kit, the one with a direct line to emergency services." Robert nodded once, accepting her terms. "I'm going too," Sarah announced, already gathering supplies. "You'll need a vet to know which medications to grab." "Mom, no!" Jason protested. "I've made up my mind," Sarah replied, her tone brooking no argument. "Eleanor will look after you and the puppies." She glanced at the older woman. "If that's acceptable." Eleanor gave a curt nod. "We'll manage." Walter checked his watch. Nearly midnight. The storm might offer a brief lull before its second wave hit at dawn, according to the last forecast they'd received. "We leave in 20 minutes, he decided. "Pack only essentials, dress in layers. If the truck gets stuck, we'll need Heidi to lead us back here on foot."
As they prepared for the dangerous journey, Walter noticed Robert kneeling beside Hope, whispering something to the struggling puppy. Then he turned to Heidi, taking her face gently between his hands. "I'm asking a lot of you, girl," Robert said, loud enough for Walter to overhear. "More than I deserve, but it's not for me this time." Heidi responded by licking his face once, her dark eyes reflecting an understanding beyond human language. In that moment, Walter recognized the bond between them. Forged in combat, tested by trauma, but ultimately unbroken. Hope gave a particularly labored breath, the makeshift tracheostomy tube barely maintaining his airway. Time was running out. "We need to go," Sarah urged, fully dressed in multiple layers with her medical bag slung across her body. Walter nodded, pulling on his heaviest coat and gloves. Robert did the same, securing Heidi's old military vest that Eleanor had somehow produced from a trunk of her son's belongings. "Brings back memories," Robert murmured, straightening the vest with practiced hands. "May they serve you better this time," Eleanor replied. As they prepared to step into the storm, Jason called out suddenly, "Mom!" His voice cracked with the fear of a child who had already lost one parent. "Please come back." Sarah embraced her son fiercely. "Count on it." Walter opened the door, and the full force of the blizzard hit them like a physical blow. Visibility extended barely beyond arm's length, the cold so intense it burned exposed skin on contact. The truck, parked in Eleanor's sheltered carport, was nearly buried under snow. "Still think this is a good idea?" Sarah shouted over the wind's howl. Walter didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to Heidi. "You ready, girl?" The German shepherd stepped forward without hesitation, her posture changing subtly as she shifted into working mode. Despite her recent ordeal, her training remained intact, a soldier answering the call of duty once more. Behind them, in the warm kitchen, Hope fought for each breath, his tiny life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Ahead lay near impossible conditions and dangerous terrain. Between them stood Heidi, embodiment of the loyalty and courage that might bridge that gap. Robert pulled his scarf tighter around his face. "Let's move out." The 3 humans and 1 dog stepped into the heart of the storm, leaving Eleanor and Jason watching from the doorway, the unspoken fear evident in their eyes. They might never see any of them again. Eleanor Wilkins stared at the closed kitchen door long after Walter's truck had disappeared into the swirling maelstrom of snow and wind. The satellite phone clutched in her weathered hand remained silent, its small green light the only indication that some connection to the outside world still existed. "They won't make it," Jason said, voicing the fear that hung heavy in the room. He sat hunched by the wood stove, his recently frost-bitten fingers wrapped in gauze. "Mom doesn't know what she's getting into." Eleanor turned, her posture military straight despite her 85 years. "Your mother is stronger than you realize, young man. She's had to be." Jason looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering directly, Eleanor moved to where the 4 remaining puppies huddled together, checking that they were warm enough. Hope's empty spot among his siblings seemed to draw everyone's attention, a small void representing the mission's urgency. "Did you know your uncle?" Eleanor asked after a moment. "Uncle Mike? Mom's brother?" Jason's brow furrowed. "Not really. He died overseas before I was born. Mom doesn't talk about him." Eleanor nodded slowly.
Most people don't talk about the things that hurt them most deeply. She settled into a chair, wincing slightly at the arthritis in her knees. Michael Thompson was a specialist in my son's unit in Afghanistan. They were close friends. Understanding dawned on Jason's face. Wait, your son was Lieutenant Colonel Wilkins? Mom keeps his picture in her office. Does she now? Eleanor's expression softened momentarily. James and Michael died in the same attack, the one Robert Davidson survived.
The revelation settled over the kitchen like a physical weight. Jason's eyes widened as connections formed.
That's why Mom was so angry when she recognized Robert. She blames him? Grief seeks targets, Eleanor replied. I did the same for many years. Easier to blame the survivor than accept the randomness of war. She glanced toward the window, beyond which the blizzard raged unabated. But harboring anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. Outside, a particularly violent gust rattled the remaining windows. One of the puppies whimpered in response, and Eleanor instinctively made soothing sounds. "Your mother never told you any of this?" she asked. Jason shook his head. "Just that Uncle Mike was a hero. That's all she ever said." "He was," Eleanor confirmed, "as was my James. As was every soul lost that day." She paused, eyes distant with memory. "And those who survived carry wounds we cannot see." "Like Robert," Jason said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "I recognized it immediately. The hypervigilance, the isolation, the shame of survival. James wrote to me about Robert before the end. Said he was the finest combat medic he'd ever served with. Had a special way with the military working dogs. And now he's out there with Mom and Walter," Jason's voice cracked. "Because of a puppy." "Because of hope," Eleanor corrected gently. "Names matter, Jason. They shape our understanding of the world." The satellite phone in Eleanor's hand suddenly crackled to life, causing both of them to jump. "Eleanor?" Walter's voice fought through static. "Can you hear me?" She pressed the device to her ear. "Barely." "Where are you?" "About halfway there." Wind howled in the background, nearly drowning his words. "Truck's holding, but visibility's zero. Heidi's incredible. She's keeping us on the road somehow." "What's your status?" Eleanor asked, military precision returning to her voice. "Cold. Very cold. Sarah's monitoring our exposure time. Robert's—" The transmission crackled. "Flashbacks. But managing. Heidi keeps him focused." "Understood. Maintain communication every 15 minutes. If you miss a check-in, we'll alert emergency services with your last known position." "Copy that." The humor in Walter's voice was evident, despite the static. "Roger Wilco, Commander Wilkins." The connection ended, and Eleanor caught Jason staring at her with newfound respect. "You were military too?" he asked. "Military intelligence, a lifetime ago," she confirmed. "Before I became a dog trainer, before I became a mother, before I became a widow, and then a grieving parent." She set the satellite phone on the table, positioned to be easily reached. "We are many things throughout our lives, Jason. Never just one story." As if to underscore her point, the smallest of the remaining puppies, a female with a white patch shaped like a star on her chest, wobbled over to Eleanor and pawed at her slippered feet. Eleanor lifted the puppy to her lap, where it promptly curled into a ball and fell asleep. "Little Star here reminds me of the first dog I ever trained," Eleanor mused. "Belgian Malinois named Coda.
Smartest dog I ever met. I never had a dog, Jason admitted. Mom always said our apartment was too small, but I think... He trailed off. She associated them with loss. Eleanor finished for him. Dogs were part of how she lost her brother. Jason nodded, reaching out to stroke one of the other puppies. Do you think they'll make it back with the medicine for hope? I think they'll try with everything they have, Eleanor answered, truthfully. Sometimes that has to be enough. They lapsed into silence, the storm their constant companion, marking time with its relentless assault. Jason eventually dozed, exhaustion overcoming worry. Eleanor remained awake, her eyes fixed on the satellite phone, waiting for the next check-in. Meanwhile, across town, Walter's truck inched forward through snowdrifts that sometimes reached the headlights. Inside the cabin, the 3 humans and 1 dog had fallen into a rhythm of survival. Robert in the back seat with Heidi, calling out her alerts. Sarah in the passenger seat, monitoring their physical conditions. Walter at the wheel, hands locked in a death grip, following Heidi's navigational instincts. Turn right at the next intersection, Robert translated Heidi's behavior. She's picking up on landmarks beneath the snow. Walter complied, though intersection was a generous term for what was now simply a slightly different pattern in the uniform whiteness surrounding them. Body temperature dropping, Sarah reported clinically, checking the thermometer she'd brought along. We need to cycle the engine off to conserve fuel, but on enough to maintain some heat. Robert leaned forward between the seats. There, he pointed through a momentary break in the snowfall. That's Main Street. The clinic's just 3 blocks up. If we can make 3 blocks, Walter muttered, feeling the truck's wheels spin before catching again. Fuel gauge is showing a 1/4 tank. Heidi whined suddenly, pawing at the window on Robert's side. He followed her gaze but saw nothing except swirling snow. What is it, girl? The German shepherd's behavior changed instantly. Alert, tense, warning. A low growl built in her throat. Stop the truck, Robert ordered. Now. Walter complied, bringing the vehicle to a gentle stop. What's wrong? She's alerting to something. Danger. Robert rolled down his window a fraction, letting in a blast of Arctic air. Listen. Beneath the howling wind came another sound, a deep, ominous creaking, followed by a sharp crack. Power poles, Sarah realized. They're coming down under the ice weight. As if summoned by her words, a tremendous crash echoed through the storm, and through the windshield they watched a utility pole topple in slow motion, power lines whipping like angry snakes as it fell directly across the road ahead of them. Back up! Walter threw the truck into reverse, but they'd barely moved when a second crash sounded behind them. We're trapped. Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. Power lines in front and behind. Robert was already pulling on his extra layers. We go on foot from here. How far to the clinic? 2 blocks, Sarah estimated, doing the same. Maybe a 1/4 mile in these conditions. Walter cut the engine. We can't all go. Someone needs to stay with the truck in case the lines are live. That's you, Walter, Robert said without hesitation. You've got the combat injury. Cold affects circulation in damaged tissue first. Walter wanted to argue but knew Robert was right. The old shrapnel wound in his knee had been aching progressively worse as the temperature dropped. Take the satellite phone, Walter instructed. Check in when you reach the clinic. Sarah gathered her medical bag, while Robert secured Heidi's protective booties, improvised from cut sections of Walter's spare gloves. 15 minutes out and back, Robert calculated,
Any longer in this cold? The unspoken risk hung between them. Exposure could kill in under 30 minutes in these conditions. "We'll make it," Sarah said with determined optimism. She squeezed Walter's shoulder. "Keep the engine running 5 minutes every half hour, enough to maintain some heat without using too much fuel." Walter nodded. "Go." Robert opened the door and Heidi leapt out, immediately taking a protective stance. Sarah followed, pulling her scarf across her face until only her eyes remained visible. Robert exited last, securing the satellite phone inside his coat. "See you soon," he promised Walter. Then they were gone, 3 dark shapes quickly swallowed by the white void of the storm. Walter watched until they disappeared completely, then settled in for the longest wait of his life since those desperate hours in the Vietnamese jungles so many decades ago. Back at Eleanor's house, the second check-in time came and went with no call. Eleanor stared at the silent satellite phone, years of military discipline warring with very human fear. "Maybe the signal's blocked by the storm," Jason offered hopefully. Eleanor didn't respond directly. Instead, she gently transferred the sleeping puppy from her lap to a blanket and stood with the careful movements of someone managing constant pain. "Where are you going?" Jason asked, as she began gathering supplies. "To make preparations," she answered cryptically, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. From it, she removed a rusted metal box stenciled with military markings. "Preparations for what?" Eleanor opened the box, revealing an ancient but well-maintained flare gun and several signal flares. "For whatever comes next." Jason watched wide-eyed as she efficiently checked each component. "You think they're in trouble?" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that hope is not a strategy." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "But it is a reason to act." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, the worst blizzard in 50 years, conspiring with fate to test the limits of 4 strangers thrown together by circumstance, and one extraordinary dog with an unbreakable bond to each of them. At the veterinary clinic, Sarah fumbled with frozen fingers to unlock the door, while Robert and Heidi stood guard against the elements. The short journey had nearly defeated them, the cold so intense it burned, the wind so powerful it repeatedly knocked them to their knees. Only Heidi's unwavering navigation had kept them from becoming disoriented and lost, a death sentence in such conditions. "Got it," Sarah gasped as the door finally yielded. They stumbled inside, closing the door against the howling gale. The clinic was dark and cold, but still significantly warmer than outside. Sarah immediately began gathering medications by flashlight. Antibiotics, IV fluids, adrenaline, steroids, everything that might help Hope and possibly the other puppies too. Robert tried the satellite phone, but inside the building's metal roof and walls, no signal penetrated. "We'll try again outside," he told Sarah, helping her pack the precious medications. As they worked, Heidi suddenly stiffened, her attention fixed on something beyond their perception. Robert recognized the change instantly, the same alert posture she had displayed in war zones when sensing hidden enemies. "What is it, girl?" he whispered. Heidi moved toward the back of the clinic, following some scent or sound invisible to human senses. Robert and Sarah exchanged glances before following cautiously. In the surgical suite, illuminated only by their flashlight beams, they discovered what had captured Heidi's attention. A large metal cabinet had been pulled away from the wall, revealing a small door, a secondary exit, presumably for emergencies. "I didn't know that was there," Sarah admitted, confused. Robert approached carefully, noting that the door was slightly ajar.
Fresh snow had blown in around its edges, forming a small drift on the clinical tile floor.
"Someone's been here," he concluded grimly. "Recently." As if on cue, Heidi growled, a deep, warning rumble that raised the hair on Robert's neck. The sound triggered something primal in his memory, and suddenly he was back in Kandahar, moving through a darkened village with Heidi at point position, sensing danger before it materialized. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now!" Sarah had just finished packing the medications. "Why? What's wrong?" Before Robert could answer, headlights swept across the front windows of the clinic, not coming from the direction of Eleanor's house, but from the opposite end of town. "Down!" Robert hissed, pulling Sarah to the floor behind the reception desk. Heidi followed silently, her body tense but disciplined. The vehicle outside stopped, car doors slammed. Voices carried faintly through the howling wind, men's voices, multiple speakers. "Who would be out in this storm?" Sarah whispered. Robert's face hardened as understanding dawned. "The same people who've been using your clinic when you're not here." The back door. Sarah's eyes widened in horrified realization. "The controlled substances cabinet. It's been tampered with before. I reported it, but the sheriff said without evidence." The front door rattled as someone tested the lock. Then came the sound of glass breaking. "They're breaking in," Sarah breathed. Robert's military training took over instantly. "Back door, now, quietly." They crawled toward the surgical suite, Heidi moving ahead with the silent precision of her combat days. Behind them, the front door crashed open, followed by the beam of a powerful flashlight sweeping the reception area. "Check the drug cabinet," a gruff voice ordered. "Make it quick. Storm's only getting worse." Sarah and Robert reached the back door just as the intruders entered the main treatment area. With agonizing care, Robert eased the door open, allowing the howling wind to mask any sound of their escape. Once outside, they faced a critical decision. Try to return to Walter and the truck, potentially leading the intruders directly to him, or find another route through the near-impossible conditions. The satellite phone remained useless, its signal blocked by the continuing storm. They were on their own, their life-saving mission now complicated by this unexpected threat. "We can't go back the way we came," Robert decided. "They'll see our tracks." "Then where?" Sarah clutched the bag of medications, her expression betraying rising panic. "We'll freeze to death in minutes without shelter." Robert looked to Heidi, who stood alert despite the brutal conditions, her training and instinct undiminished by hardship. "Girl, we need an alternate route. Can you find Walter? Find the truck?" Understanding gleamed in Heidi's intelligent eyes. She sniffed the air, turned in a complete circle, then set off at an angle to their original path. "She's working around to approach from a different direction," Robert explained, taking Sarah's arm to support her against the punishing wind. "Trust her. She won't let us down." As they struggled forward, following their canine guide through the white hell of the blizzard, Sarah suddenly grabbed Robert's arm. "This wasn't a random break-in," she said, revelation dawning despite her exhaustion. "They knew exactly when the clinic would be empty." During the worst storm in decades, Robert nodded grimly, the pieces connecting in his mind. "Someone in town, someone who knows your routines, and now they know we know." Sarah's voice trembled with more than cold. "If they see us—" The implications hung between them, carried away by the merciless wind before they could be fully articulated. Their mission had transformed from merely difficult to actively dangerous. Not only natural forces conspired against them now, but human malice as well. Heidi forged ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally looking back to ensure they followed. The medication bag grew heavier with each step, the cold more penetrating, their reserves of strength depleting rapidly. Sarah stumbled, nearly falling. Robert caught her, supporting her weight. "Keep moving," he urged. "Focus on hope, on your son, on why we're doing this." She nodded, determination returning to her eyes. Together, they pressed forward, following their four-legged guardian through the heart of the storm, carrying precious cargo that might mean life or death for the smallest member of their improvised family. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the snow, searching, probing, hunters on the trail. 1 year later, the annual Mountain Ridge Spring Festival transformed the town square into a celebration of renewal and community. Booths lined Main Street, selling everything from handcrafted items to local honey. Children ran between displays, their laughter a stark contrast to the deadly silence that had enveloped the town during what locals now simply called the Behemoth. At the center of it all stood a modest bronze statue recently unveiled, a German shepherd in alert posture, head high, ears forward, a permanent reminder of extraordinary courage during the town's darkest hours. Walter Miller, now 69, leaned on his cane as he watched the festivities from the shade of an old oak tree. His knee still ached when the weather changed, which in Colorado meant it ached most days, but he counted himself among the fortunate. The events of that February night had changed everything, not just for him, but for the entire community. "Penny for your thoughts," Eleanor Wilkins approached, spry despite her 86 years. She carried a small basket containing homemade dog treats, her contribution to the day's fundraiser. "Just marveling at how much can change in a year," Walter replied, gesturing toward the gathering crowd. Across the square, Sarah Thompson supervised the veterinary clinic's booth, where her son Jason, now 18, showcased adoption opportunities for rescued animals. The clinic itself had tripled in size, expanding into a full animal welfare center with community support and a substantial grant from an anonymous donor, though most suspected Eleanor's inheritance from her military pension had something to do with it. Some changes were long overdue, Eleanor noted, her gaze drifting toward Robert Davidson, who stood near the festival's main stage. Once the town recluse, he now served as coordinator for Mountain Ridge's newly formed emergency response team. His military experience, once a source of shame and isolation, had become an asset to the community that had embraced him. "Never thought I'd see him in a crowd," Walter observed. Eleanor smiled. "Healing comes in unexpected ways." As if on cue, Heidi trotted across the square toward them, moving with the grace that belied her now storied past. The German shepherd's coat gleamed in the spring sunshine, healthy and strong, a far cry from the desperate, starving animal Walter had followed through a blizzard 14 months earlier. Behind her came the 5 puppies, no longer tiny bundles of need, but young dogs in their own right. 4 had been adopted by Mountain Ridge families, becoming local celebrities in the process. Hope, the runt, the catalyst, the survivor, remained with Walter, having claimed the apartment above Second Chance Pet Supply as his kingdom. "Still can't believe that little one pulled through," Walter said, watching Hope prance alongside his mother and siblings. "I can," Eleanor replied simply. "Some spirits are too stubborn to extinguish." The journey back from the clinic that night had become legend in Mountain Ridge. How Robert and Sarah, guided by Heidi, had evaded both the storm and the mysterious figures hunting them. How Walter had used the last of his truck's fuel to create a diversion. How Eleanor had launched emergency flares from her rooftop despite the danger, creating a beacon that guided them home through whiteout conditions. The medications had reached Hope just in time. The makeshift surgery Robert performed, combined with Sarah's veterinary expertise, had saved the puppy's life by the narrowest of margins. For 3 days they had worked in shifts, monitoring his breathing, administering antibiotics, refusing to surrender him to the statistics that said he couldn't survive. And when the storm finally broke and National Guard helicopters reached their isolated community, they discovered that the crisis had forged something unexpected from the disparate pieces of their lives. A family of choice, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. The subsequent investigation into the clinic break-in had exposed a prescription drug theft ring operating throughout the county, with connections reaching into the local government. The mayor's resignation had followed swiftly, along with several arrests. Sarah's warnings, previously dismissed, were vindicated in the most public way possible. "They're ready for you," Jason called from across the square, waving toward the stage. Walter straightened his posture as much as his old injuries allowed. "Guess that's my cue." "I still don't understand why they insisted on this," Eleanor said as they walked together toward the waiting crowd. "You've told me 100 times you hate public speaking." 101, Walter corrected with a wry smile. "But some stories need telling, even by reluctant tellers." The festival crowd quieted as Walter took the stage, Heidi and Hope flanking him like honor guards. Robert stood nearby, ready to assist if Walter's knee troubled him. Sarah and Jason joined Eleanor in the front row, a position that would have been occupied by Martha if fate had been kinder. "Folks," Walter began, his gruff voice carrying across the square, "a year ago, I was just a grumpy old veteran selling dog food and wondering if I'd made any difference in this world." Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. "Then a starving dog stole some hamburger from my freezer, and everything changed." Walter recounted the story as he had come to understand it. How Heidi, after saving Robert in Afghanistan, had been separated from her handler during the chaotic withdrawal. Officially listed as missing in action, she had somehow made her way onto a transport plane and eventually to American soil. Whether by incredible coincidence or some deeper design of fate, she had tracked Robert's scent across thousands of miles, finding him in his mountain isolation. "She never abandoned her mission," Walter said, emotion thickening his voice, "even when logic said she should." Even when she had every reason to give up. He described how Heidi, pregnant and alone, had still recognized Robert despite his changed appearance and behavior. How she had tried to reach him through his PTSD-induced fugue. How, when that failed, she had survived on her own, giving birth in an abandoned mill, foraging for her puppies when Robert's mental state prevented him from caring for them adequately. And then, in the midst of the worst storm in half a century, she did the impossible, Walter continued. She led us through conditions that should have killed us all, not once, but twice. She reunited a mother with her son, brought healing to old wounds, and saved not just her own puppies, but an entire community. The crowd had grown silent, many wiping tears away discreetly. Eleanor stood tall, her hand resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder. Robert's gaze remained fixed on Heidi, his expression a complex mixture of pride, gratitude, and lingering sorrow. "I've been asked many times why Heidi refused to eat the food she stole," Walter said. "Why she would carry it back to her puppies while starving herself. The answer is simple, yet profound. Love doesn't calculate. It doesn't measure. It simply gives everything without reservation." He gestured toward the bronze statue gleaming in the spring sunshine. This memorial isn't just for a heroic dog. It's for the principle she embodied, that sacrifice for others isn't extraordinary. It's the most natural thing in the world, when you love without conditions. Walter stepped back, his part concluded. Robert took his place at the microphone, outlining the new emergency response protocols developed from lessons learned during the blizzard.
Sarah followed, announcing the expansion of veterinary services to include therapy dogs for veterans and trauma survivors. The formal ceremony complete, the festival resumed its cheerful atmosphere. Children lined up to pet Heidi and her offspring, now local celebrities in their own right. Walter found a bench in the shade, grateful to rest his aching knee. Hope settled at his feet, still the smallest of the litter, but now robust and energetic. Eleanor joined them, her basket now empty of treats, but full of donation receipts. Not bad for a day's work, she noted, indicating the substantial sum raised for the Animal Welfare Center. Not bad for a lifetime's work, Walter corrected, his gaze taking in the transformed community around them. Never thought I'd see Mountain Ridge like this. Connected? Eleanor suggested. Purposeful? Healed, Walter said simply. Across the square, Robert knelt to Heidi's level, his forehead resting briefly against hers in a gesture of profound connection. The German shepherd's tail wagged gently, her mission, whatever it had truly been, now complete. Sarah approached with a plate of food from the community barbecue, Jason trailing behind her. "Committee meeting at my place tonight," she reminded them. "We're finalizing plans for the Veterans Outreach Program." "Wouldn't miss it," Walter assured her. Though he'd initially resisted joining the town council, Eleanor had eventually persuaded him that his perspective was valuable. "Voice of curmudgeonly reason," she'd called it. As Sarah and Jason continued through the festival, Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "if it was all just remarkable coincidence?" Heidi finding Robert here of all places, the storm hitting when it did, all of us being thrown together at precisely the right moment. Walter considered this as he watched Hope play with a butterfly that had landed near his paws. "Martha used to say, there are no coincidences, only connections we don't understand yet." Eleanor nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Your Martha was a wise woman." "Wisest person I ever knew," Walter agreed. "Until I met a certain retired dog trainer." Eleanor's laugh, a sound rarely heard before the events of last winter, brightened the spring air. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Walter Miller." "Now that," Walter grinned, "is definitely not a coincidence." As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the festival began its gentle conclusion. Families gathered blankets and children, vendors packed unsold goods, and the square gradually emptied. Through it all, the bronze statue stood as silent witness to both what had happened and what might yet be. A reminder that even in the darkest storm, connection remains possible, and hope, however small, is worth fighting for. Walter, Eleanor, Robert, and Sarah lingered as the crowd dispersed, bound by experiences that defied simple explanation. They had entered the blizzard as strangers, each isolated by personal history and private pain. They had emerged as something else entirely, a found family, forged in crisis and tempered by shared purpose. And at the center of it all remained Heidi, the mother dog who would rather starve than let her puppies go hungry, whose next act of courage had indeed made everyone cry, but with healing tears,
rather than despair. As the spring sun set over Mountain Ridge, painting the sky in colors no winter storm could erase, Walter found himself recalling the moment when he'd first followed those bloody paw prints through the snow. How close he had come to turning back. How many lives would have remained unchanged, his own included, had he made a different choice. "You coming, Walter?" Robert called. The others were heading toward Sarah's clinic for their traditional Sunday dinner, a ritual begun during the recovery period after the storm and maintained through the changing seasons since. Walter looked down at Hope, now sitting patiently at his side. "What do you think, boy? Ready for dinner?" Hope's tail thumped against the ground in unmistakable affirmation. "We're right behind you," Walter called, rising slowly from the bench. Together, man and dog followed their family across the town square, leaving behind only footprints that would vanish with time, and a story that would not. When life's winter storms seem unbearable, remember Walter and Heidi's story. In our twilight years, we often question if we've made a difference, if connection is still possible when isolation feels easier. Walter was just a grumpy old veteran selling dog food, until a starving mother dog showed him that love doesn't calculate. It simply gives everything, without reservation. Their journey reminds us it's never too late to form new bonds, to find purpose, or to build a family of choice. Eleanor, at 85, discovered her military experience could save lives. Robert learned his trauma didn't define him. And Sarah found healing by helping others. Sometimes our greatest contributions come when we least expect them, in chapters we never anticipated writing. The courage to follow bloody paw prints through a blizzard, to choose involvement over indifference, can transform not just our own lives, but entire communities. What unexpected connections have changed the course of your life? Have you ever found family in unlikely places? Share your story below, because like Walter discovered, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply tell our truth, even through reluctant voices. Your experience might be the very beacon someone else needs to find their way home.